Okay, so good morning, and yes, we're approaching now the 18th century, which is, for most of it, at least the first 3/4 of the 18th century, it's a very pretty art, very pleasing to the eye, not too moralizing, it's flirtatious, it's showing probably a totally fictitious side of society, but it is pretty. So let's look back at the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century with the reign of Louis XIV. Louis XIV is the one who brought the whole court to Versailles for the very good reason that when he was very young, his mother and him had literally to hide at the time because the aristocracy was rebelling against the regime. And so he felt at the time that his life was threatened, and they literally were hungry at the time. So he decided that to keep the whole court and the government under his thumb, putting them in Versailles where he could have spies all over the place, making sure what was happening was a better deal for him. Not comfortable too much for the court, but definitely for Louis. One of the important dates is the 15th of October, 1685, with the Edict of Fontainebleau. Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes and repealed all the privileges that arose therefrom. And that we're talking there about the Protestant, about the Huguenots, as they called in France, that had received some privileges. They were allowed to practice their faith, but with certain restrictions. But at that time, they decided to repeal all of it, and this unfortunately really restricted the freedom of many of the people. Louis is known for the many wars, and I listed most of them here with the Franco-Dutch War between 72 and 78, the War of the League of Augsburg between 1688 and 1697, the War of the Spanish Succession. It's when the Habsburg in Spain ended up with a totally inbred king that couldn't have any heir. And so there was that war of succession around Europe where they all wanted to have their men succeeding to the Spanish throne. And the French are going to end up having the Philippe succeeding to the Habsburg. War of the Revolution, let's see if I could see at least. War of the Revolution was the French armies overrun the Habsburg-controlled Spanish Netherlands and the Franche-Comté, which is one of the part of what was Belgium and became French. War of the Reunions, that's between France and Spain and its allies. And again, this is always the idea Louis XIV wanted to conquer more territory. The main political figures under Louis XIV, Mazarin, who was his prime minister, Colbert, very strong figure, the Grand Condé, Turenne and Vauban being more on the military side. But it is under Louis XIV, and in great part because of Colbert, that Louis founded 4 academies, and that includes the Academy of Painting and Sculpture, 1648. That was done following more or less the model of what was happening in Italy at that time. The Academy of Science in 1666, the Academy of Music 1669, Academy of Architecture 1671. They also were great sponsor of literature and the arts. So we have very prominent figures, literary figures such as Molière, Racine, Corneille, Boileau, La Fontaine, Charles and Claude Perrault, and Bossuet. And these are still considered some of the main literary figures of France. As far as musicians were concerned, we have Lully, who came from Italy and who is really the one that worked very closely with Louis, who loved music and loved dancing. And so they worked quite intimately, I would say, to promote Louis on the stage. Marais is another lesser known composer, but that composed very beautiful things, particularly for the viola da gamba. Couperin and Charpentier both for mostly the harpsichord. Artist and architect that actually most of them are going to work on Versailles. Lebrun, who's going to be in charge of all the interior decoration of Versailles. Rigaud, who painted, Hyacinthe Rigaud, who painted many portraits. L'Argilière, two great portraitists. Levaux, Mansart, and Le Nôtre were three architects, Le Nôtre being a garden, a landscapist, the other two, let's say, enlarged the small hunting lodge of Louis XIII into the vast Versailles that we now know. Louis is known to have told his great-grandson, "Do not follow the bad example which I have set you. I have often undertaken war too lightly and have sustained it for vanity. Do not imitate me, but be a peaceful prince, and may you apply yourself principally to the alleviation of the burdens of your subjects," which seems to be a very wise sentence, though coming a little late, because he's really the source of what happened later on, left the country in really bad shape economically because of too many wars. So I'm going to walk you through a few of the paintings that were made under Louis XIV. So we have painters such as Claude Lorrain, who spent most of his time in Rome and was known for his very pretty, what we call the Arcadian landscapes, some that are realistic, but he was known to have a very nice device of framing his landscape with trees on both sides. He became extremely known, and for the people that were on the grand tour going down to Italy, often they would go back home with a Claude Lorrain in their luggage. In England, anybody that had a beautiful mansion had to have a Claude Lorrain landscape, and often would copy Lorrain's landscape and decorate their own backyard the way that Claude Lorrain had divided his painting. Another Frenchman who spent a lot of time in Italy is Nikola Busan. Both actually use the landscape, not pure landscape. They always have a motif within. It's either people dancing, they relate to the Old Testament, the New Testament, some mythological scene. With Nikola Busan here, you have a landscape with St. Matthew and the angel. But these are all Arcadian landscapes, very pretty, very decorative. But they really kind of the ancestor of the plain landscape that's going to happen this century. That happened, sorry, in the Netherlands, for example. As far as portraitists are concerned, Hyacinthe Rigaud, a great portraitist, did that famous portrait of Louis XIV in 1701. The monarch at that time was already old, but still very proud of his legs. As he had been a dancer, he liked his leg. As you can see, also wears heels because he wasn't very tall, and wanted, with the device of the high heel and the high wig, he wanted to dominate the other people at the court. Of course, they all copied him, so it didn't matter. But you can see how Rigaud is really portraying Louis with all the luxury of his beautiful coat with the Lis de France. L'Argilière is another very handsome portraitist that more in the Dutch tradition, if you want. He is here showing Charles Lebrun, a painter himself, surrounded by all the symbols of his art. And then we have a very different group of painters, the Lana Brothers. There were three brothers that were more specialized in everyday life of rather modest peasant family. This had become quite a fashion, if you want, in Paris, where people liked it. It's portrayed after genre paintings that you find in the Netherlands. They don't, though, look down on them. They seem to be really trying to be faithful to what they were showing. But the 18th century is called the Age of Enlightenment. And this is really important. And actually, I was reading some articles. I sent you that, by the way, that bibliography yesterday. And at the beginning of the bibliography, you have, I think, 1 or 2 books that relate to the Age of Enlightenment. And they're very relevant right now. So I would advise you to at least try to read one of them. The Age of Enlightenment is marked by really looking at the scientific revolution and really following on it. So they're looking at Copernicus, Galileo, Isaac Newton. All that research is going to happen in most European countries. And the principles of enlightenment were really based on liberty, progress, reason, tolerance, and fraternity. And this is very much what the forefathers of the US are going to look at and bring it back to their own country. There is an increase in empiricism and scientific rigor. So they really want to not only be theoretician, but look at experiences. They're going to do lab work, if you want, to try to make sure that what they're doing is correct or discover new things. They are questioning the abuses of the church and the religious orthodoxy. The church had definitely erred in many ways and had been opposed by the Protestants. We know that in the early 16th century, we have the beginning of the Reformation, and France remained very Catholic. But had there were whole areas with the Huguenots who were followers of Calvin's most of the time, and that were repressed very bloodily, I would say. So they're questioning, these abuses, and a man like we'll see Voltaire is really going to go against the church and try to show that there should be a freedom of speech that was very much closed down at that time, repressed, as I said. But it is interesting, it is during that period that we find what we call enlightened absolutism. Catherine II of Russia, Joseph II of Austria, Frederick I of Prussia. And that really is a contrast with the total absolutism in France with Louis XIV and followed by Louis XV. So the main figures in France of that enlightenment, which is in French, le siècle des Lumières, literally the century of light. The main figures are Voltaire, who wrote an enormous amount of work, the probably most marking the Dictionnaire philosophique, the philosophical dictionary, and the letters on the English. He spent some exile in England and really fell in love with it. Beside these works, he wrote a lot of plays. He wrote lots of little history, very satirical, that were actually not well received by the power, but well received by many of the society in France. Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert are going to be what we call the Encyclopedist. They are the ones who are going to put together the huge work of the Encyclopedia that was published between 1751 and 1772 in 35 volumes, mind you, not enabling many people to actually purchase them. And then Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is, you've heard a lot, Discourse on Inequality and the Social Contract. The man that is going to actually be quite opposed by Voltaire, who didn't like his style. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wanted to live in nature, wanted to appreciate nature, go back to the roots, was looking at the man as being born well, being born as a good person, and it's only his society and what was around him that would corrupt him, literally. So these figures and others are really going to model, if you want, if you can think in terms of sculpture, what's going to happen is they open the eyes of people. And it's with many of these ideas that the French Revolution is going to take place, unfortunately, much more bloody than anybody ever expected. So succeeding to Louis XIV, we have a gap because the young Louis XV was 5 by the time his great-grandfather died. And so it is the nephew of Louis XIV's, Philippe d'Orléans, who is going to be the regent between 1715 and 1723. And Philippe d'Orléans was known to be a very hard worker, but he was a 9-to-5 type of worker. So he didn't like Versailles, and he wants to come back, the court to come back to Paris. He settles in the Palais Royal in 1715, and then it's the craze because the whole court now has to come back to Paris, and they're going to start building rehab all kind of houses in Paris so that they would be comfortable. And this is going to really launch the Rococo style, because that they are so tired with the last years of Louis XIV that with Madame de Maintenon had become a very austere king. And so following the return to Paris, we have gaiety and frivolity that succeeds to that austerity and devotion. The salons that give reason back its dignity. They shake off tradition and authority. The arts abandon the grand goût of the Baroque in favor of fantasy, which is the Rococo. And then we'll talk a little bit about the 1720, which is unfortunately a very dark moment with the Mississippi bubble. And I'm going to let you simmer a little bit in the bubble until we talk about it at the next slide. In 1725, Louis XV will marry Marie Leczinska, daughter of Stanislaw I, the deposed king of Poland. They're going to have a pretty good marriage. Louis will live until 74 and marry until 68. They will have 10 children. And it's literally at the 10th child in the, I think it's in 36, that the doctor will tell Mary, you know, this is it. You can't have children anymore because the next person who dies is you. And so she literally is going to close the door to the king, who is then going to move to official mistresses. And the first one that really is going to be a marking mistress is the Marquise de Pompadour, born Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, who's going to be the mistress of the king from 1745 to 64, and will be a huge patron of the arts and of the philosophers, mind you. In 1764, there is a break between them, though the Marquise will remain friend, but not anymore a mistress. And in 68, she will be succeeded by the Comtesse du Barry, who will remain the mistress of the king until 74. In 1754, Louis XVI had died. He was the grandson of Louis XV, the Dauphin, So part of the 10 children, the Dauphin died before his father. And it's so his son who is going to succeed Louis XVI, as I say. He was 20 when his grandfather died. In 1770, 4 years before the death of Louis XV, he will marry the 14-year-old Habsburg Archduchess Maria Antonia, the youngest daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Francis I, and his wife, and we can say the formidable Empress Maria Theresa, who is going to be the total power in that dynasty. Maria Antonia, of course, Marie Antoinette, known the sad story of hers. She married that Louis XVI, who was a particular character. They went kind of along, had only 3 children. And of course, in 1789, the whole story of the Bourbon dynasty is going to end, at least momentarily, with the French Revolution. In 1792, on the 13th of August, the king is officially arrested and sent to the Temple, where he will be imprisoned. On the 21st of September of the same year, the National Assembly declared France to be a republic and abolished the monarchy. And then on the 21st of January, 1793, the king is beheaded by guillotine on the Place de la Révolution. So this is, of course, a sad end. It was to be expected in a sense, but turned out to be an incredibly bloody revolution. So I promised to talk to you about the Mississippi bubble and John Law. This is an interesting thing because I came to rediscover it with this class. John Law was actually a Scottish economic theorist and financial wizard. He was actually a friend of the regent Philip, and had to kind of go away quickly from Scotland because of some of the transactions he had done that were not quite straight, but came to France and decided to establish the Banque Générale, with the idea that he was trying to straighten up the terrible economic condition that existed in France at that time. And by establishing the Banque Générale, he was trying to centralize all the financial transaction, if you want, of what was happening in France. Shortly after that, in 1717, he established the Compagnie d'Occident, the Company of the West. And 2 years later, the Compagnie des Indes, the Company of the Indies. Very quickly, people were interested in that because he was, with these 2 companies, making a lot of trades. And so the shares that were worth 500 livres early on very quickly climbed to 18,000 livres, which you see is an enormous turnout. So really encouraged by that, he issued around about 625,000 stock shares. And this is where the bad thing started, because that was far too much for the revenues coming from these 2 companies. He then merged the Banque Générale with the Compagnie des Indes, and took over the collection of French taxes and the minting of money. Therefore, got the control on both the country's foreign trade and its finances. But what ensued was speculation on the stock. They printed increased amounts of paper money that brought a galloping inflation. And then, as you can expect, all these paper money lost their values. And so that was it. The stock shares were worth nothing. And by 1720, it happened what they call the Mississippi bubble, and the stock market crash in France and in other countries. The Compagnie des Indes and Compagnie d'Occident were in fact really regulating everything from the Mississippi literally and north, New Orleans and Louisiana and so on. All these were included in these speculations. So if you want to know more about it, John Law, of course, became the scapegoat of the story. He was in great part responsible and had to flee France very quickly. So this is something to look at, because you'll see how it will have an impact on almost everyone. It was so tempting at first that many people invested a lot of money in there. So when we talk about Rococo, it seems kind of a funny word. It sounds French, and it definitely is derived from a French word, the word rocaille. The French word for fancy rock or shell work. And when you see this type of garden that you see on the upper right there, this is called in France, jardin rocaille. So where you have rocks that go down, this is typically on the slope, and then you have these flowers that seem to emerge from the rocks. Very pretty, and I remember as a child, my father had a beautiful rocaille that I loved. But the word also comes from these grottos that were fashioned in Italy and in France. And here you have what was the grotto in Versailles. So this is with these type of grottos, you can see the pebble work inside and this cascading decoration, very organic type of forms. And so it is in there that it originated. It is at first purely decorative arts. It becomes more architectural at first, then later on we'll see the paintings are going to follow. They are characterized by organic shapes, exuberant decoration, pastel colors. So we leave the very deeply saturated tones of the Baroque with these deep reds and rich gold and so on. Now everything is more in the pinks and pale blue and pale green and pale yellow, etc. Curving forms, a lot of arabesques and delicate features. Women have long necks, tiny little feet. You wonder how they can walk on it, very thin hands. The themes are typically pastoral landscapes and courtly scenes. And then we'll see a development in churches with very complex floor plans. One of the best examples of, not too many remain actually, of the Rococo interior is in the Hôtel de Soubise in Paris. The exterior of that hotel that was rehabbed in the early 18th century seems very neoclassical with the pediments and the columns and so on. But then inside, many rooms had been redone with the Rococo style. Of these, only really two remain, and the one I'm going to show you is the Salon de la Princesse. The whole house now is actually one of the official archives, let's say a place where they protect all the archives in the city of Paris. The interior is absolutely wonderful, and you see that great change from the Baroque art. It can be sometimes, if you look at Versailles, there are some things that you can believe was an inspiration to. The large windows as on the Galerie des Glaces in Versailles, but you have these very large windows, so making the room very light. But then you can see how the decoration, you don't know exactly where painting starts and finishes. It is so much included in the architectural decoration. Beautiful ceilings with lots of stuccos, gold and white, lots of cherubs, and very pretty paintings. So we're going to now look at some of the painters that have particularly marked that period. And the first one is Jean-Antoine Watto. who was born in the town of Valenciennes. And Valenciennes is close to the Belgian border. So he is, as far as the tradition and the past, he's very much influenced by what was done in the Low Countries. He will leave Valenciennes for Paris in 1702, and he's going to make lots of copies of the genre paintings that were in the Flemish and Dutch tradition. He will then, in 1703, work with the painter Claude Gillot, who is going to make him make him acquainted with the characters of the Commedia dell'arte, so that particular type of very spontaneous theater genre that comes straight from Italy. He is all his career influences by Peter Paul Rubens on one side, particularly for the colors and the exuberance, but also by the Venetian masters of the same time. So we talk about Tiepolo and others of the same contemporary to Tiepolo, with a kind of a refinement and a kind of a light that is very particular to them. In 1712, he is accepted as a full member of the Academy, and his presentation piece that will come 5 years later will be the pilgrimage to Citera. We'll see it later. And he dies very young, age of 36, from tuberculous laryngitis in 1721. The fête galant that he's going to be so good at really is split between sympathy, wistfulness, but also sadness. You have that feeling that he shows a lot of people in love and so on, but shows that in fact, love is very transient and it doesn't always last very long. And that also the other earthly delights are just temporary. He will be followed by Nicolas Lancret and Jean-Baptiste Pater. So here are some of his works. This is an early work, The Country Dance, where you can see definitely his Flemish roots, if you want, with the dark tones of the landscape, very ochre, and the subject matter. But it is rendered with very much of a Venetian gusto. The light and the brilliance of his figures at the front and the grace of them is much more Venetian than it is Flemish. He is going to make a lot of decorative panels to be included in these interior designs, as you have seen in the Salon de la Princesse. And at that time is because of enhanced trading routes between France and China becomes a new fashion. And that fashion we call chinoiserie. So it's literally art, and it's going to be decorative art that are inspired by Chinese motifs. So here we have these panels that used to be in a small room in the Château de la Muette, who was a 16th century hunting lodge. Unfortunately, there were 30 paintings and only these two have survived. But these are some of the very early examples of chinoiserie that we can see. And it's interesting to see the Chinese man there who is playing the hurdy-gurdy. And I'm not sure that that was played in China at that time. It's characterized typically by symmetry, an emphasis on the decorative, and definitely rejecting the Renaissance illusionism. It's shown often that chinoiserie is an alternative to the classical revival that started in the 18th century. But what Watto is really known for are his theater pieces where he represents some of art actors and actresses performing in what seems to be not a stage, but literally a natural decor. On the left, you have the French comedy, and on the right, you have the Italian comedy. And this really is going to become the great specialty of Watto, who really, you can see his love for theater. The Comédie Française, that is really the example that he shows with the French comedy, was founded by Louis XIV in 1680, where he merged two companies that existed in Paris into one. And these became the company that, by the way, Molière will head at the time and will write for, and still exists, the Comédie Française across from the Louvre. The Italian comedy comes from the Commedia dell'arte, which is that theatrical form characterized by improvised dialogue and then a cast of very colorful stock characters that come back constantly. This emerged in Italy in the 15th century and then gained popularity all over Europe, particularly in France. So you can see how here they have costumes that are particular to each of the characters and make you able to recognize each of them. Whereas there, you have them more dressed à la mode, you know, the way they were at that time, but then are disguised, as we can see, for example, reclined on that stone bench, we have Bacchus, who is cheering with one of the other characters. Often we see also some of the main characters, real actors that are identified as this one on the left, Pierre Sirois, who was an actor and who's representing Gilles. Gilles, who was a particular stock character that you find in the theater, typically dressed in white and with that kind of floppy hat on the back. The one, the Mezzetin, is a stock character of the Commedia dell'arte who was an amorous valet who frequently engaged in the pursuit of unrequited love. Here is shown, you know, in that garden playing guitar with the statue of a young woman in the background turning her back to him, which shows that he's been dropped, he's been head, and so you have that very melancholic sound coming out of the guitar. But it is definitely the departures from the island of Citra. And actually, there are discussions on the title. Some see it as the pilgrims leaving the island of Citra. Some others see pilgrims that are leaving for the island of Citra. But I would agree with the leaving the island title better than the other, because the people look very nostalgic. Citra was the island where the goddess of love was born. And so it's the whole idea, if you go to the island of Citra, this is where she was born, this is where love flourishes, and you have actually a sculpture representing the goddess of love on the side. And then it's, again, we talk about the transience of love. So they are now seeming to go down to the sea, where they can go back on the ship and go back home. So you have these moments, is love going to be over by the time they go home? So a lot of nostalgia, if you want. But the painting is very luxuriant, the very beautiful decor, very luscious trees, beautiful costumes that actually are going to literally come to for the women to wear the name of the robe à la Watto. As you can see in this painting of the Fête Vénitienne, the Venetian feast party done in 1718 and 19. As you can see, the young woman in the center wears that beautiful dress, and you can see the back, which is very typical of the robe à la Watto, so dress, the Watto fashion. That's literally the way it became named. And you have, it's kind of a coat that is hanging at the back of the dress. Again, very often you have that atmosphere in Watteau's paintings of beauty, entertainment up to a point, but there's always that kind of nostalgia, like they're having fun, but they know it's going to end. At that time, it is literally at that time that fashion is really going to start putting France in the center of the fashion world. Everybody has to be dressed the French way. These type of paintings are called the fête galante, the gallant feast, if you want. Very typical of some of the later works of Watto. The very known Gilles by Watto is in fact portraying the painter himself. I don't know if you remember his features on, I have it next to his biography. He was a man with very fine features, very delicate. And here you can recognize him, but in that very plain costume of Gilles, there's a great contrast between the refinement of the man himself and then the kind of general strange costume that Gilles is wearing. He's surrounded by other figures from the theater that seem to be completely oblivious to his solitude. This is an absolutely beautiful work of that so-called stage character, but you have such a sense of isolation and odd man out, as you could say. And this work, the Enseigne de Gersaint that he made for Gersaint, who was the great art dealer in Paris and a very good friend of Watto, and by the way, Watto will literally die in his arms, is probably one of his, if not the masterwork of, definitely at the end of his life. This is where you can see that Watto has cut away from the pure Rococo decoration. He keeps that sense of the genre painting that was done in the Netherlands, in the north and south. And here he's literally creating a decor that could be recognizable to any connoisseur in Paris. He's just removed the front facade of that shop so that people can see what's happening in it. And it's beautifully done. You have the pavement here, which is supposed to be the outside, the street. And you see that very well-dressed young woman getting up that one step. You can see her shoe there under the dress, helped by the gentleman who was there. She's looking into that crate where some paintings and mirrors are coming out by the helpers. Here you have on the other side a couple, an older couple, who is looking in detail at that 18th century painting, very recognizable. But on the walls are a lot of genre paintings that would be literally to the taste of Watto, which means Rubens and some of his favorite painters. And when you see that, it's like they invite us in, yet you want to join the connoisseurs. What is interesting is that little dog there, he literally borrowed that from Rubens' painting of the coronation of Mary of Medici. So this is a homage, to the painter that he admired so much. Very different character is Jean-Marc Nattier. Jean-Marc Natier was born in 1685 in Paris, the second son of Marc Natier, who was himself a portrait painter, and Marie Courtois, who was a miniaturist. Many women were miniaturists. It was an art that almost followed the female line for a long time. He was enrolled in 1703 in the Royal Academy. And then instead of going to Rome, as most of the painters would do at that time, he decided to go to Amsterdam in 1715, where Peter the Great was at that time. Peter, who admired very much the Dutch, went there to Amsterdam and studied how they were building the ships. And liked also the way the Republic was organized. He painted actually portraits of the Tsar and the to-be Empress to be Catherine, who wasn't married to him yet. But he declined an offer to go to Russia. By 1718, he became member of the Academy. And unfortunately, the Mississippi bubble ruined him. And because of that, at that time, we have to realize that any good painter's ambition was to paint history paintings by which they could become really famous. But the bread and butter for a painter were portraits. And so he had to devote himself almost entirely to portraits. Unfortunately for him, his only son drowned in the Tiber River in Rome in 1754, and that really hit him hard. In 1766, he died in Paris. He had difficulties having his name recognized towards the end of his life, and so he died almost unknown by that time. He was known for excellent portraiture, but very often turning the portraits into an allegory. So here, it's not the case. We have a straight portrait of Catherine I, who was the second wife of Peter the Great. And she functioned, as you know, as a co-ruler when her husband, from 1724 until his death, and reigned as sole Empress of Russia from 1725 until her own death in 27. She was the first woman to rule Imperial Russia, and with a strong hand, but a great protector of the arts. This is by Natier, the portrait of Louis XV, the beloved, he was called. He was loved by many people in his country. And then Marie Adélaïde of France as Diana. So this is an allegory showing one of the royal princesses as Diane. And very interesting, because this is such a totally different representation of her. For those of you that know the Phoenix Art Museum, they have the large portrait by Adélaïde Labiguière of Madame Adélaïde, very stiff, as she was known to be, and not very gentle. And so here, I think Natier makes her almost amiable. Madame de Pompadour, also the mistress of King Louis XV, and Diane also, shown very pretty. She was a pretty woman and very ambitious, but rendered very beautifully by Natier. Natier has that almost, not velvety, silk. It's like silk. His paintings are very much like silk, always making women look very good and a beautiful complexion. The Queen, Marie Leczinska, Queen of France, was apparently a very nice person. Madame Victoire, one of the youngest sisters of Adélaïde. She was 15. This is shortly after she came back from the Abbey of Fontevraud, where the youngest daughters were raised to cut the cost from the education, what would have been if they had been in Paris. But she then begged her father to come back, and around age 12 came back to the court. She was on the, to the contrary of Madame Adélaïde, apparently a very nice person. And I think Nathier can show this, that smile on her face is quite attractive. Neither Adélaïde nor Victoire married. Only one of the sisters, the eldest one, married. But by the time of the revolution, the 7 sisters had died. 5 sisters had died. Just Victoire and Adélaïde remained. And this is Madame Henriette, another of the sisters. And here it's really interesting in this portrait, which is kind of late in his career. He's kind of going back to that Baroque style, heavier with much more saturated colors. And unfortunately, I think they take completely away from the sitter. But probably one of the most known of the Rococo painter is Francois Boucher. Born in Paris, son of another painter, Nikola Busan, apprenticed to Francois Lemoine, won the Grand Prix de Rome for painting in 1720 and left to Rome in 1725, stayed there until 31. Then he came back in 31 and was admitted to the refounded Academy of Painting and Sculpture, became a faculty member there in 34, became the director of the Gobelin factory in 1755. So Gobelin factory, which was making tapestries as well as these very large carpets, became in 65 the director of the Academy and became King's painter. And he died in 1770 in Paris, again, pretty poor and forgotten by people. Along with his painting, he also designed theater costumes and sets, provided models for the Sèvres porcelain factory, and designs for the Beauvais and Gobelin tapestry factories. The Goncourt brothers in the 19th century mentioned that Boucher is one of those men who represent the taste of a century, who express, personify, and embody it. And unfortunately, as often as I think what Watto was showing is things don't last too long. And whereas he was very successful at the time, but because of the pressure of the people, the philosophers, Diderot in particular, who was trying to move away from the frivolous side of the Rococo style, he had to completely change his style, and he wasn't very successful at it. So I would at that time, before I start into Boucher, I'm going to ask you, those of you that want to unmute, and then we can have 10 minutes until come back by 11:10. And I see that there's a question.
So I'm very curious about that painting in the art gallery.
Yes,
there was a very dark figure sitting on the counter. Was that another dog, or was that like some kind of another pet or something?
A dark figure in the gallery?
In that painting of the art gallery.
Scène de Gersaint. Yeah, no, there is a lady who is leaning forward.
And then on top of the counter, there's this black figure. It looks like it might be a dog, or it might be some.
No, I think it's a clock. I think it's a clock.
There's no face.
And
no, it's on. Yes.
No, I don't know if others are having the same problem. I'm having a problem with the sound. It's kind of very rough. I mean, sometimes.
Is it bad? Is the sound bad?
I don't have a problem with it.
It must be with you, because I see heads telling me no, the sound is okay.
Okay, so it's my own.
Yeah, you know, for some of you, it might be good to put a headset or have the earbuds to hear, because I have a computer that has really good sound. So nobody.
On my side. It's the first time it happens, so don't worry.
Yeah, so no, apparently I have other people telling me, no, it's good.
Good.
So no, that Enceinte de Gersaint is a magnificent painting. I really love it, and departs so much from other things that were done at that time. It's very unique. But this is the way, by the time, that you have art dealers at that time, where you would go in and choose your paintings. You didn't always have to commission some.
And I have a question.
Yes, John.
In this Watto,
Yes.
he has two paintings that you show. One is French comedy, the
Yes.
other is Italian comedy.
Yes.
They both are out in the field. I mean, what was the meaning of comedy for them in those times? I mean, it's very different from...
No, you know, I don't know how familiar you are with Molière. So have you ever read some of Molière's work? These were, I adore Molière. These are comedies where the language is superb because it's all in verses. But is such an extraordinary painting, if you want, of society. And Molière at that time got really in trouble actually with the king from Times because he wasn't hiding who he was criticizing, but it's all done with humor. And that was the comedy of the time, in French in particular. And I really, if you have never read Molière, don't need to read it in French, but try to find a translation because they are the bourgeois gentilhomme, or, you know, it's marvelous, showing that kind of guy who's making a lot of money and now he wants to be more than what he actually is. And
I never read it.
It's absolutely marvelous because he's, you know, he's hiring, because he has a lot of money, he hires all kind of people to teach him how to dance, how to speak. And for example, in the speech, the professor comes and tells him, you know, how to make verses. And he says, but if I don't make verses, what do you do? Oh, but you speak prose. Oh, I speak prose naturally. You see, he's so ignorant that he takes it. It's just fabulous. He has the l'avare, so the avaricious. Oh, I have all his works there. There are tons. He wrote so much. And that can give you a good idea of comedy of the time. They were very, probably a little more elitist than what English comedy was at that time. It's a different type of humor. As you know, humor is cultural, and so it's different. And then the Commedia dell'arte is very different because there you have, it's always the same figures that come back. Whereas with Molière, it's every time a different scheme.
Okay.
So comedy was very much loved. They had tragedy too, but the comedy was very much loved. It was lighter. It was, you know, what it is now. But the tragedies, then they were going back to the Greeks and had similar things than the Greeks. You had the El Cid and so on and so on. Yeah. So very tragic things, always ending up with death and murder and so on. So,
okay, thank you.
But that's not the same. That would have been a different kind of theater. So did I had, oh, what did I do? Oh, no, I'll show it next time. On Tuesday, I will bring up what, John, what you had raised as the idea of the Pietà. I'm going to show it because I thought it was a good point and I had missed, I should have brought in the German Pietà to explain in the sense that Cosmo Natura painting. And but I really encourage you all to be there on Tuesday. The Botticelli presentation is going to be quite interesting. So be there. We only know very little of what Botticelli did, but he did a lot, and he unfortunately is supposed to have destroyed a lot of his works too. I don't know if you're all back, but we can go on if you want. So I'm going to mute you all. Like this one here, and go on with Boucher. So now we know that very early on, to try to survive, Boucher worked in the porcelain factory, and it was not porcelain yet, but in ceramics, and he painted works himself. Later on, he then designed some motifs that were applied on porcelain, and this is the Sèvres porcelain after Boucher. So it was another painter, but copied some Boucher chinoiserie, as you can see. And he is going to have a great influence actually on the porcelain art in France. He's, as you heard, also is going to design cartoons to be made into tapestries. And this is one realized tapestry after one of his paintings called the Collation, from the Italian village scenes, woven at Beauvais. So he's going to do both Beauvais and the Gobelin. Here is a room in England, in Worcester, the Rom Tapestry, designed by Robert Adam, who's interestingly enough was very much of a neoclassical interior designer, but he's using some of the tapestry designed by Boucher. These were, by the way, woven at Gobelin manufactory in Paris. Was begun in 1763 and completed in 1771. So you can see how in the tapestry, he reproduces some of the motifs that would have been stucco motifs on the walls or in the ceiling. But Boucher is very known on these very delicate, you can see now what I mean by the delicate features of the Rococo women, very fine faces, powdered, having the little mouche, glued on the side, just tiny feet. Oh my gosh, you don't know how they can walk with such small feet, very thin wrists, etc. So here you see that toilette that actually was part of a set of paintings on the various times of day. The young lady dressing in the morning with her maid. And you can see how she's wearing, even the maid is wearing a robe à la Watto. You can also see the screen behind her, which is a chinoiserie, would be copied from Chinese motifs. The Chinese dance that follows here is actually a cartoon for a Chinese tapestry that will be woven in Beauvais. So the way they were doing is the painter would paint the life-size project for the tapestry that was then taken to the manufacturer and then be there as a model for the weavers. And it shows, their own idea of what China looked like, which didn't always represent exactly what it was, but it was a fantasy work. Very known are the nudes by Boucher, where literally, look at these women, they porcelain skin, very pretty. This one was actually commissioned by Madame de Pompadour for decoration for her bathroom, literally, in the Chateau de Bellevue that had been given to her by the king. And then when she goes, the king will recover it, and then interestingly enough will give it to his daughters to live in. This is in the surrounding of Paris, has been demolished since. So what you see very typically is the toilet of Venus. So there we have the the goddess, she's surrounded by cherubs, and we have all kind of attributes. Cupids and doves were both the attributes of Venus. The flowers allude to her role as patroness of the gardens. We have also pearls here above that tray, that refer to her mysterious birth from the sea. And literally between Rubens in the previous century and then Renoir in the century that follows, these are three figures that are very known for these sumptuous nudes. Another painting also had been commissioned by Madame Pompadour for the same room, actually, in the chateau, shows the bath of Venus, and we have again the goddess surrounded by cherubs and doves. We have here two of the project, the sketches that made by Boucher for that painting. One with just from the model, and shows how very delicately Boucher is treating the nudes and the model very much in detail, and shows the softness in which his drawings were made. He's a fabulous draftsman. And then you have in the one below at the Hermitage how he's projecting nature, that very rich nature around it. This painting is different. This is not a goddess. It is actually painted after a young woman whose name was Louise O'Murphy, who was a young Irish woman who worked as Boucher's model and became, for a brief period of time, the mistress of Louis XV. Pretty young, as you can see, and was one of the favorite Boucher model for a while. She's not presented here as a Venus of classical beauty, but to the opposite, it kind of shows a provocative pose of kind of unambiguous erotic persuasion for what you could consider a child woman. Though, despite the fact Boucher was quite esteemed by his clientele, he was also criticized mostly by the philosophers for just the eroticism and the frivolity of his works. Definitely, he has a tremendous skill in rendering fabrics or skin, but people were really trying to bring some more moralizing images that were closer, I think, to the reality surrounding the people in France. Here we have that painting that shows just a study of the foot. And I think it's beautiful, the delicatesse of that foot on that bedsheet, and then the great drapery around, very lush. Boucher was very appreciated by the Marquise de Pompadour, and so he made multiple portraits of her. And these are always quite interesting because they are showing, it's just like the Marquise is caught by surprise at the time she's painted. In this case, she's in the middle of a reading. And the intention is very much to show her as an intellectual, which she was. She loved to be instrumental in bringing art to a certain level. She was very instrumental in the factory of Sèvres and Beauvais and Gobelin, but wanted to show herself not just as a mistress, but a person of intellect. And the dress is absolutely extraordinary, all embroidered roses on the taffeta. Another of the portraits of Madame the Marquise de Pompadour in the garden this time. together with a beautiful sculpture of love and friendship. And this was a sculpture that had been, in reality, commissioned from Pigalle, that we will see later on. It's actually trying to symbolize what's happened later, is when she is not anymore the official mistress of the king, she will remain a very good friend of his. And so she wants to emphasize their platonic relationship with the king. This was also commissioned, by the way, for the Bellevue castle. Towards the end of his career, Boucher then changed course and became much wiser. As you can see now, his figures are dressed on the way and typically are going to show some very moralizing images of a family together, family reading, mother teaching her children how to read, sometimes allegories on the Holy Family of the Virgin, Joseph and baby Jesus. So here again, we have the wealth of the beauty, the lushness of nature around the figures. But this doesn't really fit Boucher. So unfortunately for him, he made many of these type of paintings, but that departed so much from his original works that he died pretty poor. The next painter is quite interesting. He also, as you can see, died, he died 60s, early 70s, was born in Grasse in the south of France. And for those of you that know the south of France, Grasse is the capital of perfume. It's known for its voluptuous nature all around, and that is going to follow Jean-Honoré Fragonard for his entire career. He will become the apprentice to Boucher in 1740, and then Chardin, and then back to Boucher. Won the Prix de Rome in 52, and will study at the French Academy in Rome, where he becomes a very good friend with Hubert Robert, who we'll see next. He admires the masters of the Dutch and Flemish school, Rubens, Hals, Rembrandt, and Ruysdael, and also the Italian Rococo painter Tiepolo. He will be admitted to the Academy in 65 and marries 4 years later Marianne Gérard, who is the sister of the painter Gérard, who is a neoclassical painter, but she herself is a delightful painter of miniatures, really does a beautiful work. In 73, he will return to Italy and then come back the year after, but traveling through Vienna, Prague, Dresden, Frankfurt, and Strasbourg. And then in 1790, just a year after the beginning of the revolution, will return to Grasse to avoid the terrible things that were happening in Paris, but has tried to go back to Paris in the early 1800s and will die there completely forgotten. He is absolutely extraordinary in handling local color and has a marvelous brushstroke, and you will see how this will be an influence on the Impressionists. In the early works, you can see definitely the influence of Boucher, very much working in the same ways, but the way he represents nature, and you have here at the front a beautiful still life with a big pumpkin and then flowers and fruits, is very much Fragonard. And the light that he brings in is much more Italian too. This is where Tiepolo comes into it. During his stay in Italy, he admired the gardens. And this painting, Le Petit Parc, is very much derived from drawings he had made in the gardens of the Villa d'Este in Tivoli in 1760, where you can see that there are some figures, because at that time they were rarely painting landscapes without figures, but they completely lost in the debauch of of nature between the trees and the vines and everything that is around. Very known is this painting that is in the Wallace collection in London, The Swing. And this is just an adorable painting. It was actually a commission from a rich aristocrat who at first went to a more known painter than Fragonard, and who refused because he thought it was frivolous. But what the nobleman wanted is, I desired, he said, that you should paint Madame, showing his mistress, on a swing, which is being set in motion by a bishop. You must place me where I can have a good view of the legs of this pretty little thing. And so this is exactly what you see, is the young lady is pushed by the bishop, so probably the wife of the bishop, we can think, or the daughter, who knows. And but hidden in the bushes is the lover, who just has absolutely in awe of what he sees under the skirt of the young lady, while her slipper is slipping from her foot and is probably going to land in the hands of the lover. So this is, of course, super frivolous. A lot of underlying messages there. You have the little sculptures there that just confirm the idea of love around it. But it's just a delight. And again, you can see that nature with that kind of haze in the background is beautiful. To me, Fragonard for the century is probably one of the most extraordinary portraitists that you can find. Portraits that are always full of invention and of movement. He's very much following what Diderot was saying, that you see there on the right. Diderot, who wanted things to be real, but also portraits should represent what the people do. And so in these fanciful figures, he painted about 14 of these portraits, and they all enchanting, absolutely superb. The one on the left is the Abbé de Saint-Non, who was one of Fragonard's rich patron. And he's the one who really pushed him and introduced him into the academy. Mademoiselle Guimard was a dancer, and I think her position is very elegant and could make you understand that she's a dancer. And then Denis Diderot, the encyclopedist, one of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, is there. And he really demanded what is called the grace of action. He wanted an action appropriate to the activity of the sitter, which would give, of course, to the portrait truth and naturalness of presentation. But I think the portraits are just, you expect people to move. You see the fabric almost flying for the Abbé de Saint-Non. It's extraordinary. Other decoration, these are decorative panels that would be included in the interior design of rooms. These are called boiseries, you can see. So that would really probably included in particular frames on the side of the room. Shows a game of horse and rider. These were two games that were very fashionable at that time. The horse and rider game is the players are divided into two teams. You have the riders who run and leap, and then they go on the back of the horse who is leaning on the tree here. And then the person who gets all these people on the back finally has to push the first one that falls is going to have to replace him. That was a typical game for the kids. A game of hot cockle is something different. In French, it's called à la main chaude. La main chaude is a game where the one person has to be what they call the penitent, has to lean forward on something and be unable to see what's happening, has to have his hand on the back, and kids go one after the other behind and then clap the hand on his hand, and he has to recognize who it is. And once he recognizes the person who he recognizes becomes the penitent. macho, the hot hand. And now the decorative panel, this is the progress of love at the Frick collection, in case you go, where you see different episodes of love adventures of two people, the pursuit on the left, where you see the young lady walking away with the young man trying to catch her. And then finally she allows him to meet her. Then he confessed that his love to her, and then he's going to be crowned by his new lover. But the way commissioned by the Comtesse du Barry, so the other official mistress of Louis XV. She commissioned these 4 panels for her salon and in her property of Louvciennes. The great friend of Fragonard was Hubert Robert. And Hubert Robert is a wonderful and lesser known painter and draftsman. He makes some very sensitive works. It's really beautiful. Was born in Paris in 1733, left for Rome with the Etienne Francois de Choiseul, who was the son of his father's employer, visited the ruins of Pompeii, and did a lot of sketch outdoor from nature. Worked for a time in the studio of Panini, who was a very known painter in Rome at that time, and then spent time in the circle of Piranesi. Piranesi was an engraver, an extraordinary draftsman, and who made a whole multiple books about the ruins of Rome, the Roman ruins, as well as some of the churches that were in bad condition, but did an extraordinary work. And then the carceri, of course, the prisons. We'll see him once we touch Italy. In 1965, he returned to Paris and was received by the Académie Royale the next year with Roman Capriccio, which is an invention of Roman architecture. 1967, he was exhibited at the Salon and was very much appreciated by Diderot with the idea which the ruins awake in me are grand. So that's almost a romantic feeling, by the way, that the idea of ruins can make you feel grand. He's going to be appointed designer of the King's Garden, keeper of the King's pictures, and keeper of the museum and counselor to the Academy. After the beginning of the revolution, he will be arrested because of his connection with the king, but then pretty shortly after liberated. And in 1995 will be placed on the Committee of 5 in charge of the new National Museum at the Palais du Louvre. It is at that time that the Louvre becomes a museum, and will die unexpectedly in 1808 of a stroke. His works are grand. This is the finding of the Laocoon. This is when in 1506, this is a representation that in 1506, the whole group that you see here of the Laocoon and his sons was found in a vineyard in the surroundings of Rome. And that was an incredible revolution, if you want, in the search for antiquities around the capital of the Papal States at the time. The Laocoon had been noted, was really written about in classical literature as an incredible work of art, and then had disappeared and was found in 1506. And it's quite a controversy, I'm not going to get into it. Michelangelo was in awe of that rediscovery, and it's going to be a very influential sculpture from then on. Is going to inspire a lot of other sculptures. This is a marvelous art with the beautiful coffered ceilings, and the gallery with all the emperor's statues. of course, this is much larger than would anything if you think of the proportion of the figures compared to the size. This is, of course, a pure invention. Closer to reality is that St. Peter's Square in Rome shows you a very different view that we would see nowadays. As you can see, it's a dirt floor, but you have the beautiful colonnade of Bernini around, and the obelisk and the fountains. The Academy, the French Academy's founding in Rome was really, in fact, done to establish a durable relationship between Italy and France. And when I say Italy, this is not yet, it's still the Papal States as far as Rome is concerned. So for some young artists, being there was extraordinary, because they could see the Renaissance artists, they could see the classical art that they were unable to see in their own country. One of the landscapes by Robert of the demolition of the houses on the Pont Notre Dame in 1786 shows, in fact, the bridge, as it was often the case in that time, had the houses built on the bridge and stores at the floor level. But just as you see in the Ponte Vecchio in Florence, or some of the bridges in Venice. So these are the old houses that are demolished at the time. When he was put in charge of the Louvre, he did two really important paintings. And we're going to start with the one on the right, with the imagery view of the Grande Galerie in the Louvre in ruins. Because this is, of course, what you would call a capriccio in Italian. It's an invention. The Louvre never looked that way. But it was showing the Louvre as if it was one of these ruins he had witnessed in Italy. And this is going to give him an idea of that design for the Grande Galerie in the Louvre, which until then had only a few windows in the walls, but this was plain roofing, and so not giving any lights. And it is after that design that he did that the Louvre was rehabbed, if you want, with these glass ceilings that allowed the light to come in, and enabling the viewers to see what they were admiring. One of the other extraordinary painters at that time is Jean-Baptiste Seymour, who was born in Paris in 1699, was admitted to the Academy of Saint-Luc, that's another Royal Academy, in 1724, and then became a member of the Royal Academy in 28. But at the level of painting animals and fruit. So there was a hierarchy. When you were at the Academy, you were admitted at one of these levels, the highest level being the history paintings, and then you had portrait painting, then you had genre painting and landscapes, and finally the lowest of the lowest was the animals and fruits. But maybe it was a lower level, but he just excelled into it. In 1731, he will marry Marguerite Saint-Art, who will die 4 years later. And unfortunately, he will lose his daughter 2 years later. In 1740, he will be presented to Louis XV and will remarry in 45 with Marguerite Pouget. His only son, Pierre-Jean Chardin, will commit suicide in Venice in 67. Unfortunately for him, in 1776, he started losing his sight and turned to pastel we can't say paintings, but drawing if you want. And 1779 will die in Paris. Again, these are people that left quite a legacy and influenced Manet, Matisse, Cézanne, and even later Soutine and Braque. His still lifes are absolutely extraordinary. We did have some at the Phoenix Art Museum in '97 when we had the exhibition with copper as canvas, because he did paint on copper for some of his works. These two paintings are actually the paintings that introduced him into the Royal Academy. One is the ray, stingray hanging there with the little cat looking at oysters, and you have a series of other fish. And then again, if you are in love with still life paintings, you really have to appreciate the skill of a painter to render these different textures, the way the light reverberates on these different textures, on the picture, on the cloth, on the knife, and the knife is of course protruding, giving you a sense of perspective. And then the buffet, showing this time it's a dog at the bottom who is smelling what could become a very nice meal for him. And an abundance of fruits that were always very much appreciated. But he's very known also for some of his paintings, what you could call genre painting. In a sense, it's a following of the Lana Brothers, but with much nicer palette of color, and showing these not poor people, but really middle, petit bourgeois, that middle class in a very soft way. Middle class showing they are clean, they are working hard, and they're really trying to move on. So a lot of moralizing figures showing here the young school mistress and the young student. In a sense, it's a little bit, you can think of Vermeer, but with less brilliance in the way it's painted. The Omobula is also in the tradition of Dutch painting, the soap bubble that has, of course, a lot of symbolism in the idea of the transience of human existence. Just like a soap bubble which can burst, so can be life. And this is very much in the tradition. Here is a painting by Frans van Mieris, the elder, of the boy blowing bubble. Same thing. So this is more in the David Teniers style. These interiors, very modest interior. The young woman, don't look for symbolism. She's just right now, looks like cleaning a turnip. And there are different tools of her trade. She's a large pumpkin, the citrouille, as you say in French. And then some potatoes and other turnips that she's preparing a soup. And again, you can see how this had been an influence on Cézanne and his still lives. The basket of peaches with walnut, and always, as the tradition is in these, you always have the protruding knife, the walnuts, and again, very different. You have the velvety peaches, you have the harsh texture of the walnuts, the reflection of light on the glass of wine. And then here, a different kind of surface. This is pewter. And then here you have ceramic and apples. But this is becoming almost stylized. Well, it's actually not pewter, but silver. Sorry. But we also have to realize there were sculptors in that world. One of the most famous, Jean-Baptiste Pigalle, one of his most famous sculpture, Mercury tying his sandals. He studied under another sculptor, Jean-Baptiste Seymour, and went to Rome from 1736 to 39. He really endured poverty in his early life. And it's only when he made this sculpture that he was admitted at the Académie Royale in 1744. And then became very successful. He's a superb craftsman, very versatile and very inventive. He was known as a portraitist also for the warmth and vivacity. I'm going to show you some of the most important work that he did. This is the mausoleum of the Maréchal of the Saxe that is in Strasbourg. Was inaugurated in 1776 and shows the Marshal standing before the pyramid of immortality, moving towards, as you can see, the open sarcophagus, opened by death, while France, the female figure there, is trying to intervene. So a lot of allegories accompany that very large monument. And then one of the interesting sculpture that he did was of Voltaire. This is called Voltaire Nu, which is in the Louvre. In 1770, a group of people of the literary society, including Diderot and D'Alembert, wanted to pay homage to Voltaire with a marble statue in his likeness, which was a very rare thing. And they literally asked Pigalle to do it. But Pigalle came with the idea he wanted, just like the classical heroic statues of the antiquity, he wanted Voltaire to be shown in the nude. But in the nude, at the age that Voltaire was an old man. This is literally 2 years before his death. He wasn't in very good health and looked his age, let's put it that way. He went to Ferney, where Voltaire lived at the Swiss border, came back with a portrait of his face and started the work. And Voltaire tried to change his mind. He didn't want to be seen in the nude, but Pigalle insisted. And finally, literally, Voltaire, for the very generously allowed him to do it with just the idea of the freedom of speech, if you want, the freedom of representation. It shocked a lot of people when it came out, to the point that the King Gustavus III of Sweden offered to contribute to the cost of a coat, which seems quite interesting. But anyway, at that time, in a sense, it was refused for the purpose it had. Pigalle was looking at the sculpture he had seen in Rome, which is by now in the Louvre, of the Old Fisherman, or also known as Dying Seneca, that shows an older man in the nude also. It's not the philosopher, it now is believed to be a fisherman. So as the painting didn't fulfill its purpose, Voltaire was offered then another sculpture, which is now in the Comédie Française, and that's the one by Houdon, the Voltaire Assis, that we will see later on, which is a very different representation and probably more appropriate to our eyes, showing the amazing vivacity of the face of that man who had tremendous sense of humor and could be very sarcastic too. Very different in style is Étienne Maurice Falconet. He was not only a sculptor, but also a writer on art. He was also a pupil of Jean-Baptiste Seymour, and probably the most Rococo of the sculptors that existed at that time. He always made these very much Boucher-like, slightly erotic figures, often reproduced, by the way, in porcelain at the Sèvres factory. This is a monument to Peter the Great, so very different to the figures we just saw now. It is Diderot who actually introduced falconet to Peter the Great. And then Clodion, another of these great artists, went to Paris in 1755 and became a pupil to Pigalle a little later. He won the Grand Prix of Sculpture and went to Rome in 1762. He was so good that actually Catherine of Russia, Catherine II of Russia, wanted him to come to St. Petersburg, but he decided he didn't want to go there. He worked mostly in terracotta and just with incredible sensitivity when you see the folds of the dress there. It's very beautiful, very fine work, the mourner. And then this larger piece, this is about it's about 4 feet high, the invention of the balloon. And of course, we think of the hot air balloon, which was invented in France at that time. And you see that cascade of cherubs that seem to be frolicking around the balloon. Just beautiful little image. It's undulating. It's almost musical when you look at it. This was supposed to be done on a larger scale, and unfortunately the project was abandoned. So we have more painters to see, but we will do that in 2 weeks, when we will look at the late French Rococo painting, and we will also look at furniture and art decorative. This is a really interesting time, but we will look at Vigée Lebrun, we look at Adélaïde Lévy-Guiard, Greuze, Quentin Latour. So these are some of the painters. And then we'll look at an array of cabinet makers that became very famous at that time, were signing their works. And some of the porcelain, though it's not in these chronological order, because as we know, porcelain in Europe came first in Meissen, Germany. So at this time, I'm going to stop the recording.